This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's Electric Cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include Director of NC Policy Watch, Chris Fitzsimon, former House Speaker Joe Mavredick, former Chairman of the state's Board of Education and former State Senator Howard Lee, and fresh from a week of vacation at the beach, syndicated columnist and author John Hood. On NC Spin show number 981, we've got some important news for our Raleigh-Durham viewers. We'll ask our panel to respond to legislative rules on redistricting, talk about shrinking school districts and the ongoing feud between the State Board of Education and the Superintendent of Public Instruction, and we ask what happened to civility. Plus, as always, we'll ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Before we get started, let's begin with the news for our Raleigh-Durham NC Spin viewers. Beginning September 10th, NC Spin will no longer air on WRAL because they're expanding their Sunday morning news. But starting on September 10th, NC Spin will begin airing on Fox 50 at 6:30 a.m., as well as our regular time at 8:30 a.m. Please follow us to Fox 50 at 6:30 and 8:30 beginning September 10th. Now let's discuss the rules the legislators have set for redistricting. Lawmakers were ordered by the court to draw new legislative districts to correct 28 declared unconstitutional because of racial gerrymandering. The others they set the criteria they set included districts of equal population, continuity. Okay. I'll say it right in a minute. County groupings and traversals, compactness, fewer split districts, municipal boundaries, previous election data, and incumbency protection. Joe, the legislators said they were not going to consider racial data at all in drawing these districts. Can they completely ignore racial data and still be in compliance with the Voting Rights Act?
There's two parts of the question. Can they do it without using race? Yes, they can. Can they do it without using race and be in compliance? I think that's a big question. Everybody has to remember that the second go-around on these districts was approved by the Obama administration, their Justice and Civil Rights section. So, yeah, I think it can be done. I think it's going to be interesting. It might be just a move on the checkerboard to get the Democrats to say, wait a minute, you haven't considered race, and therefore you're supposed to consider race. And that, I think, is a chip on the table for the Republicans.
But that ruling didn't completely eliminate any racial consideration, did it?
No.
This is the nature of our problem, is that the Supreme Court did rule on North Carolina's districts, and 5 of the justices did conclude that North Carolina had used race too much. But it's important to remember that 4 of those 5 essentially bought the plaintiffs' arguments that the legislature should have used a different set of criteria, still race conscious, but have the percentages, for example, in the 40s for a black percentage in a district rather than 51. The other Justice, Clarence Thomas, who did side with the majority and gave them the 5-4 decision, he was the one that basically tipped it over to strike the, he said race shouldn't be used at all. So that's important. That's the reason why you heard this articulation that the legislature of North Carolina is not going to use race.
But Howard,
they're aiming for Clarence Thomas.
But Howard, the Democrats say if no consideration of race is considered, there's no way of knowing where there's racial discrimination or not. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think that has the possibility of giving that kind of argument. I just don't think the legislature can draw districts without including race as a consideration in designing these districts. And I agree with John. They can't go overboard in packing these districts with one group, especially black voters, and not give consideration to spreading them out. So I don't think they can get away with not using race at all.
Chris, this is the first time, I think we've always known that this happened, but this is the first time that there was sort of an incumbency protection clause put in that criteria. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, it has always been there. That's the way that they start drawing the districts, figure out where the legislators they want to protect are, and then draw districts around them. I think that they could have gone, if they had not included that, they would have gone a long way toward responding to the momentum, I think, that's building across North Carolina to draw districts fairly, regardless of where people live, and let voters choose their politicians instead of politicians choosing their voters. But I want to get back to the race question for a second, or just overall thing that the challenge the General Assembly has. Their worst nightmare is that the court draws the districts. So that's their worst nightmare. So what they want to do is adjust the districts just a little bit, maintain as much partisan gerrymandering without talking about it as they can, and not offend the courts enough so the court's not going to give them another chance. If the court says these districts are unconstitutional, the court's going to appoint a special master and draw the maps themselves. Republicans are deathly afraid of that. So they're walking a tightrope here, and that's what all this is about.
But back to this business of protecting incumbents, Joe. Representative David Lewis, who is one of the co-chairs of this redistricting commission for the legislature, stopped short of saying they weren't going to do any double bunking. This has been a technique that's been used through many redistricting procedures going back 20 or 30 years, particularly if you're, whichever party is the majority party, you double bunk a minority member into that district so as to get rid of an incumbent. Is this going to take place here?
I think it can take place in one or two districts. I don't think that's anything unusual. You know, for our viewers, the easy way to look at this is, from the racial aspect of this, is to just think about building peanut butter sandwiches. If you're going to build a peanut butter sandwiches and you make it very thick for the Democrats, then you have fewer sandwiches. If you spread the peanut butter very thin, then you have more sandwiches for the Democrats. And that's what the bottom line is in the racial issue. The other thing is, given today's technology, you can draw districts very, very smartly from any point of view and come out ahead.
And that's one of the things that they said, was that they were going to use past voting data to be able, election data, to be able to determine these new districts. John, what's that going to tell them?
Well, that's what they always
Where the
use.
Republican districts are?
They're identifying voting patterns, and that by the way, often correlates with the racial breakdowns. So you go, lots of people have argued that racial gerrymandering and partisan gerrymandering are different. They are difficult to distinguish. The other thing I would say about this is, it's funny, you're sort of damned if you do and damned if you don't. If you don't protect incumbents, you will absolutely have double bunking, and people will criticize you for double bunking. If you avoid double bunking, that means protecting the incumbents. Now, you got to make one choice or the other,
Unless you're
and they're going to
putting two incumbents
criticize,
in the same district.
which is double bunking.
Yeah.
So the point is, they're going to criticize you either way, and so they need to make the policies that are fair to the citizens, to the voters. Those are the people for whom districts are actually drawn.
No, that's not really. I don't agree with John. You got to get enough votes to pass a bill, and you only get votes from people who are sitting in the assembly. And if you want to come back and they want your vote, then you better be protected. Let's not overlook this little political issue.
All right, so Howard, going back to a point that Chris made a few minutes ago, Democrats are going to submit maps. The legislature is going to submit maps. The court's going to look at all of them. The alternatives here, it appears, they accept the legislature's maps, they accept the Democrats' maps, or they don't like any of them and decide to do it themselves. What's your prediction of what's going to happen here?
I'm a little concerned that there's going to be a split between the Democrats and the Republicans. The Republicans are going to have a map, and the Democrats, and I think they're going to be conflicting in some way. I'm guessing that the court is probably going to step in the long run and take over this process and draw these maps.
Wow.
Unless the legislature gets a lot smarter than what Democrats were when I was a part of it. Because, see, I'm one of those incumbents that got kicked out by this whole districting thing.
We have several on this panel who were.
So I'm not very.
I got it with Howard. You know, I was in the 1980-81 redistricting, and I think I won my seat in 82 or 83 by like less than 300 votes.
Wow.
Nobody else voted. I didn't
Yeah.
have any opponents.
Yeah.
Come on.
All right. Well, in case you missed the announcement at the top of the show, we want to remind you again that NC Spin's no longer going to be airing on on WRAL in the Raleigh-Durham market beginning Sunday, September 10th. Instead, we will move on that date to Fox 50 at our regular time of 6:30. But you can continue to get balanced debate from the Old North State and watch our program each week by visiting our website, ncspin.com. When we come back, school bells are ringing.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
I hear it all the time. Rising health care costs are squeezing North Carolina families. Deductibles continue to climb, prescription drug prices are skyrocketing, medical bills are unknown until they arrive in the mail, and premiums are increasing by double digits. This is decimating family budgets. We should be focused on education and jobs, not EpiPen cost and medical bill errors. We need quality, affordable, and transparent health care for our families.
The North Carolina General Assembly recently gave state retirees a well-deserved cost of living increase. Now local governments across North Carolina need to follow the legislature's lead and include retiree cost of living increases in their budgets. These increases are long overdue and desperately needed by all our retirees. The legislature heard us and they did what's right. It's time for local governments to do the same. Learn more at ncrgea.com.
We now return to NC Spin.
The lawsuit regarding who's responsible for public education continues, and we want to talk about an interview that State Superintendent of Public Instruction Mark Johnson recently gave. But in addition, we want to talk about the legislature's desire to create smaller school districts within more metropolitan areas. Howard Lee, for many years, the legislature strongly encouraged counties to consolidate multiple school districts into a single district within county lines. Now there's some belief that some of these districts in counties like Wake and Mecklenburg have grown too large and should be split into 2 or more districts. As former chair of the State Board of Education, we'd like to hear your viewpoint on splitting up some of these county districts.
Well, you may recall that it was in the early 90s that the legislature actually passed legislation directing counties to consolidate systems. I feel a little guilty about talking about the importance of these larger districts or consolidated districts because I was able to get Orange County pulled out so Chapel Hill could keep its district and Orange County could have a district. I think we certainly need to relook at the bigger districts. I don't think we need to look at the whole question. Wake, Mecklenburg, Guilford have really grown in population and the districts have become really overbearing in many ways. But one final point, I'm one who believes that it's not the size of the district that necessarily impacts the educational experience, but giving more power and flexibility to the local school building and letting the principal be the determining factor on how to lead.
And Joe, one of the arguments for all of this was by consolidating, we could save money. We wouldn't have to have quite as much administrative staff and school bus staff and so forth like that. So what are the advantages of splitting these districts up?
Well, they are exactly what you said. Like Howard, I was involved in the 80s in the legislation or the study that proposed we go down to 100 LEAs. And I still believe that was a good idea.
It never quite made it.
No, and the reason is that at the local level, often the LEA gets packed at the top because people want 4 years working at the district, at the board headquarters, inflate their salaries and get a little bit better off. I think we need to start looking at other urban areas around America and how well they are doing with large systems. Quite honestly, I think Wake and Mecklenburg both score very well nationally in the competition among who's doing the best with student outcomes.
We need to say that this is not a law. This has not been passed. It's a study commission. What was the impetus behind wanting to study it, Chris?
Well, I think they're Chris Malone, among others. Chris Malone, a former Wake County School Board member, but I think a lot of the impetus comes from suburban Charlotte and the Mint Hill Matthews area where people have been sort of clamoring. They have a couple ideas. One is they want to allow the cities to run their own charter schools. Another one is they want to look at splitting Charlotte-Mecklenburg into 2 or 3 school districts so they can sort of have their own school district. I don't think this is at the heart of this time. among legislators, maybe not, but it's also worth remembering the history of why a lot of these school districts were combined in the first place, because a generation ago there was a black school district and a white school district, and they were kept separate and allegedly equal, and they weren't equal, and that's
then
where
there
a
were
lot of
county
this came
schools
from.
and city
That's right.
schools. And John, the current lawsuit between the State Board of Education and the legislature has raised the question again, who's in charge of public education? The courts sided initially with Superintendent Mark Johnson, but the State Board is appealing that ruling, saying that the Constitution is pretty clear as to who makes policy decisions. Did the court ignore the Constitution in ruling in favor of Superintendent Johnson?
Absolutely not. If you read the decision is very clear. You can disagree with the decision, but it is very clear, it is very specific in the constitutional language. The State Board of Education under the Constitution has certain oversight powers. They're written in the Constitution, but the relationship is clearly in the Constitution, specifically subject to the laws passed by the General Assembly. Period. Now, that's what the court says, that the legislature has the authority to define this relationship. It's not obvious that anything that they did violates the fundamental powers of the State Board. I'm not saying I have a firm answer on this one way or the other, but the decision that was done by the three-judge panel was entirely reasonable.
Howard, there's a lot of tension going on between the superintendent and the State Board of Education, but hasn't that always been the case?
I was going to say, tell me something new. Yeah, that's been a pull and tug going back as far as our good friend Craig Phillips, and it's come full forward all the way up to this point. So I don't know that we're ever going to live to see the resolve between the State Board and the superintendent.
Joe, what a lot of people are saying is what all of this does is once again raise this issue so far as public school governance in North Carolina, and that we really need to change our Constitution.
There's no question about that. We do need a constitutional change because we are organized for mediocrity in North Carolina education from top to bottom. And until we decide that we want to have a first-rate, national leading education system in North Carolina, from K all the way through the university system, we will not get there unless we change the way we lead.
I got about 45 seconds left, and I want to ask, if you were going to make this change, and of course the voters of North Carolina would have to vote for a constitutional amendment on this, what changes would you make, Chris?
Well, I think it probably makes sense to go either one way or the other. We try to have an appointed superintendent, but the people are never, I don't think, going to give up the right to vote. But I actually think, I wanted to jump in here really quick. Superintendent June Atkinson was a Democrat. Chairman of the State Board of Education, Bill Kobe, was a Republican. They worked very well together. They don't have to not work together. Mark Johnson took office, I think, with a little bit of a chip on his shoulder and seemed to be confrontational from the beginning, didn't meet with staff people who were open. I think this was sort of spoiled from the beginning, and they've never been able to recover.
Well, of course, the other side of it is he says they are impeding his hiring people into the department.
Well, he didn't do a very good job of reaching out. I think Bill Kobe is a person that was willing and still willing to work with him.
If we were going to change the Constitution, Howard, what would you change?
I would probably go with an appointed superintendent and put it under the governor's office.
All right.
I would put the board elected from national congressional districts.
Okay. And then the superintendent
That'd be the
appointed?
board, and they would hire their superintendent.
John, what would you do?
I might do something like that, and I would also recognize that it probably doesn't matter very much. There seems to be no correlation between how states are organized between a state board and a superintendent and student performance. Just no correlation at all. I'm in favor of straightening this out for administrative reasons, but it is unlikely to make a whole lot of difference in the classroom.
Interesting. Okay. Well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the growing lack of civility.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
The cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you. I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
You sleep on concrete till your body get immune to concrete.
My mom got my brother and I up and said, come on, we're leaving.
I became homeless in the beginning of this year.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, our house caught fire.
I used to see my brother. If he see me, he'd turn and go the other direction.
We did the only thing that we could think of, and we went to a Salvation Army shelter.
You know, we don't have this, like, what's your background look like? We just say, what do you need?
I remember the man from the Salvation Army coming down with a box of clothes.
The Salvation Army officer bought my brother and I an ice cream cone.
Last week, my brother walked up to me, and he just started a conversation.
Today I've given my life to the Salvation Army because I remember what somebody did for me, my brother, and my mom over 30 years ago.
The Salvation Army for me means hope.
Compassion.
Family.
Support.
We now return to NC Spin.
When we started NC Spin 19 years ago, one of our guiding principles was, as Chris Fitzsimon so succinctly stated, we could disagree without being disagreeable. And for the most part, we've been able to accomplish this goal. But there's an alarming lack of civility in our state and nation today. Most of our panelists offer opinions, write columns, make speeches throughout the state. And I can tell you, the ugly name-calling and just plain nasty responses we get are alarming. John Hood, you wrote a column this week about this very thing, saying you think this is a dangerous moment. You stated that over 3 decades of writing columns, you've often gotten critical comments, but recently someone expressed the hope that someone would silence your voice. What's changed to give people the belief they can say anything they want to in any way they want to today?
Well, I think the problem is that Chris got a hold of my email address. But my point fundamentally was this.
We just lost the civility, didn't we? Okay.
But there was, first of all, you've got to be able to make jokes and have fun. Politics is a serious business, but if you don't get along with people and be able to rib and poke at each other, which we do, you're not going to have a productive conversation. But the other point I was making in the column, Tom, and we see this episodically in recent years, even the event that happened in Durham the other day, where some folks tore down a Confederate statue, it's an example of this problem of people thinking that if they don't get their way right off the bat, if they get involved in politics and they don't elect the candidate they want, or they debate an issue and the vote doesn't go their way, they have the right to take the law into their own hands. Now, obviously, in a free society, you're going to win some, you're going to lose some. You have to be willing for a while to live under policies you don't like and wait for the next election.
We do seem to have gone from raising the nastiness of the talk into violence in recent months and
we've
years.
gone.
Is this different from the way it always
We've
was?
gone through this in our history many times. I mean, I think we're living through a very contentious political time. Unfortunately, I think that spills over into violence. But I was thinking when you were talking about this topic about the comments, and I get them too. I mean, it's astonishing the things that I'll be sent email, and not all of them, but a lot of them on social media and even email are anonymous. And I think one of the things that has changed is it is very possible now, in fact, a lot of people do this, is communicate anonymously.
Yeah.
So they can say anything they want and they're not accountable, you don't know who they are. And I think that has gone a long way toward
it reduces their inhibitions.
And Howard, I was going to ask, how much has social media played into this?
Because I think it's one of the major keys that allow people to have this level of flexibility and they don't have to be accountable for what they say or do.
So, Joe, okay, we're agreeing that right now we're not living in a time of civility. What do we got to do to bring it back? Mama used to say, if you can't say something nice about somebody, don't say anything. Why do we get back to a more civil society?
Well, I think our society is developed now where everybody's got a right and nobody's got a responsibility. And Howard put his finger on it. You know, responsibility because you know who's talking.
Well, I'm responsible for us taking a break right now so we can come back and ask the panel to tell us something we don't know.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
The healthcare landscape is filled with questions and uncertainties of changes that are coming. In these times of change, there's one thing you can trust. You can trust your family physician to work for you, not only in treating sickness and disease, but also your overall health. Regardless of how healthcare might change, the men and women of the North Carolina Academy of Family Physicians pledge to work upholding your trust. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisors.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
We now return to NC Spin.
Okay, here we go. Time to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Joe Mavretic, I'm going to start with you.
We're completing a fundamental shift in American society. We were a patriarchy before 1840. By the middle of this century, we will have become a matriarchy. And many of the questions and issues that are before us today are the result of this change in the values and priorities of male versus female.
Interesting. Chris Fitzsimon, tell us something we don't know.
Well, I think one of the sleeper issues is how our courts work. I haven't talked a lot about it. We've talked a lot on this show and other places. Representative Burr wants to redistrict all the courts. I think it's pretty clear that a lot of his motivations are political to elect more Republican judges. That the House leadership seems to like that plan now, but nobody's talking about this yet. The Senate leadership wants a merit selection plan for judges. They've been going around the state talking to judges, talking to individual judges, talking to groups of judges. They're going to come out maybe even this fall with a merit selection plan for judges. The court system is going to be dramatically different in not too many years.
John Hood, tell us something we don't know.
U.S. News and World Report just came out with its list, its ranking of hospitals nationwide. North Carolina had high representation. The top 10 hospitals, Duke, of course, was number one. Of the top 10 hospitals, 6 of them were private, 3 of them were state university related. One of them, the Charlotte one, the Carolinas Medical Center, is really a hospital authority. It demonstrates that different arrangements, public, private, nonprofit, can all deliver public services with taxpayer dollars competitively and well.
Howard Lee, tell us something we don't know.
Merrick Moore Elementary School is one of those that I partnered with last year through my institute, and I'm very proud to report that this low-performing school, 80% free and reduced lunch, has shown marked improvement in grade level performance and, of course, having reduced the number of teacher turnovers from 50% a year ago to 10% this year.
Wow. We need to share that with the rest of the state.
Fantastic principle that we have in place over there. He's a great young man.
Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback, and read my weekly column, be sure to visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. And join us next week when we'll have more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.